It took me about an hour this morning to go from hotel to hotel. I was just like in awe. Amazing. But also because I'm kind of doing, well, not only I here really as a guest of both the science track and the gaming track, but of course that's appropriate because I really do both. And so I have you know, one whole complete life in the games industry that tends to be where I earn money. I have another entire life in the space industry that also tends to be where I squander money. But I think they've both been pretty significant, and they're intertwined in ways that may not be obvious. But I'll show you the intersection of those things. And so what I wanted to do today, there's really kind of four topics that I want to talk about today. You know, one is, first I'm going to start with computer games, because computer games are, for me, how all this happened. I believe we're in a third grand era of gaming now that a lot of traditional gamers like yourselves are probably very skeptical of, but I'll elucidate, you know, hopefully I might be able to convince you. Of course, that was the bridge to my own flight, so I'll tell you a little bit about my own flight. I'll then take a minute to, you know, the most profound thing about flying in space is just seeing the Earth from space and what a life-changing event that is. So I've got some slides about seeing the Earth from space and why I hope you all get a chance to go. And then finally, the fact that there's a new space race on, and I think you all will get the chance to go. And so I'm going to show you what I think that looks like, and why, even though you might think that space travel is very unlikely, I don't think most of you even at the DragonCon 1 would have predicted I would have made it. But it hasn't gotten harder, it's actually getting easier and easier, and it's getting easier fast. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so let me start in with computer games. You know, for me, the computer games really started as the intersection of my parents. I mean, my father, as you heard, was a NASA astronaut, and that kind of gave me my interest in science and technology. My mother is an artist. That, of course, gave me my interest in art. And if you think about what is the quintessential high-tech art, I would argue that is computer games. That's some great high-tech art there. But that's where I got my start in the 70s, was on a teletype machine. I wrote 28 little games, called them D&D 1 through D&D 28. They were, you know, on a teletype, so every time you made a move, you had to wait about 40 seconds for it to print out the little 10x10 grid around you. You know, $ signs for treasure, U for up ladders, D for down ladders, and capital A was a giant ant. And then when the Apple II emerged on the scene, I then sat down and with my mother, the artist, she showed me how to draw perspective artistically. And with my dad, I figured out the trigonometry to how to calculate it. I then wrote all the H-plot commands in Apple II Basic to draw these little dungeon corridors. And I took the fiction that I had written for my D&D campaign, which was one of the rare times I got an A in English class. And you look at my handwriting and all the scribble on it, why I got an A for that, I cannot imagine, except it was probably one of the few things I actually turned in. But that became the basis, my D&D world became the basis of my first published product, which was called a Calibeth. And for those of you who have seen or heard of a Calibeth, which at least there's a few, what's interesting about that is I wrote that in my senior year in high school, and it took me about 6 weeks worth of after school time. The owner of the Computerland store near my house convinced me that this game that he watched me working on, at the shop basically, was better than anything else that was on the pegboard of the wall. He convinced me to self-publish, which meant buy some Ziploc bags and put some Xerox cover sheets in it. I sold about 15 of the version that you see on the leftmost column. So, by the way, one of those was just on eBay for $3,000.
Wow.
So they're really quite rare. But then a publisher called California Pacific, that was the publisher of my mentor, a guy named Bill Budge, called me up and said, hey, we'd like to distribute it nationally. They first put it in the middle Ziploc bag, but I didn't like their artists, so I encouraged them to go to the third version, the right-hand column there, you'll see was the eventual way it showed up, and most people have seen it, if they've seen it at all. But they sold about 30,000 copies. My royalties were $5 a unit, and if you do that math, that's $150,000 for a high school senior for 6 weeks of after school time. That's a pretty good ROI, considering it cost me $0. In fact, that actually was twice my father's salary as an astronaut. So it was one of these things where you're going like, maybe I should make some more of these. and that's really what spawned the Ultima series. You you can see how they kind of go from 1 in the upper left to 9 in the bottom right, and you can kind of see the technology has evolved down through the years, and as well as the craft of making the games. For those of you Ultima players, my favorites are 4, 7, and UO are probably my favorites of the bunch. But obviously that did pretty well for me, and I'm pleased to have had a chance to do it. But I also call that the first era of games. And what I define as the first era is it means you go to a retail store, you pay $50, you bring it home and install on a pretty expensive home computer, fairly complicated instructions, not that great of UIs usually, and so the market was basically you all. Teenage male nerds on the water parts are females, you know what I mean? And that sold, but still, like, a best-selling game sold to millions of customers, and so there's still a ton of money in the industry, and we thought that we had in fact, at the end of this is when the games industry surpassed the movie industry in scale, when we were still selling solo-player games. But then I was fortunate enough to have convinced my bosses at this point, Electronic Arts, to allow us to make Ultima Online. Their sales projections, by the way, for that game were 30,000 units lifetime, because that was the largest selling multiplayer game that had ever existed previously in history. And so that's why they didn't really want us to do it. They actually resisted us doing it. When we finally shipped Ultima Online, which I'm guessing some of you have seen, that game became the fastest selling PC game in Origin in EA history. It surpassed all the older Ultimas combined times 10 within 2 years. And so this opened the door to what has really been for what I'll call from just before the year 2000 to close to the year 2010, the massively multiplayer era, where even though solo-player games have by no means gone away, massively multiplayer games are literally 10 times bigger, not only individually, but in a total market size. And so it's, if you're in the business, if you're not only just making games for fun, but you're also trying to do a business around it, the business has really been driven by the multiplayer, if not the massively multiplayer era for that decade. And I would describe this era as you still have to go to the retail store, you still have to pay $50, you bring it home, now you actually put a credit card in and subscribe for $10 before you ever play it. You then install it, boot it up, then you have to actually go through more complex instructions. You have to not only create a character for an hour, but play for probably 2 hours for a mission cycle before you actually know if the game's any good. And so that's actually a higher barrier to entry. And yet the fact that you can play with other real people means it's sold to a much larger audience. And so suddenly it went from 1s of millions to 10s of millions of players that play through massively multiplayer. Still mostly male. Women began to join the picture, at least in small quantities. The age demographic changed. Anyway, I think this era we just finished. By the way, I now think we're going into the third era, for which I'm now going to build what I'm loosely calling New Britannia. So my next reinvention of what you would call a role-playing game on the computer, and planning to do in this third era. I would call this third era broadly mobile and/or social. Probably most of you as traditional gamers probably look at, quote, social games and go, oh my gosh, what horrible things are there on that side of the fence? Do I? But what's important to me is to don't take out of your mind the kinds of games that you see, and instead focus on the distribution method. What's important about this third era is that instead of having to go to the store and pay $50, you just download it in an app store or on the web, and it's either free or an impulse purchase. You don't have to install it, you don't have to subscribe to it, you can just sit down and play it. If somebody sends you a link, whether email or whatever else, tells you about it on the App Store, you click on a link, you just begin to play. No instructions, no create a character for an hour or play the first quest cycle for 2 hours. The game has to tell you within 5 minutes if this is something you're really going to want to play. I can't tell you any free MMOs I've tried for 3 hours to determine no, they're not any good. Any game in the new era has to communicate what it's about, like a movie does. The first 5 minutes of any movie is usually a flash forward into the action sequences. Any modern game that's going to survive in this new era has to communicate why it's relevant in 5 minutes. However, I don't think that means that you have to look at the current casual games and go, that's what the future is. Because what's happening is, since people can find a game for free or impulse, find out within 5 minutes any good, after that you're probably willing to pay for it. And especially if you wait till I'm addicted to it, I'll be happy to pay for it. And so that is really what I think is so critical about the new era. And the new era is now moving from tens of millions of players to we're just about across hundreds of millions of players per product. And so even this wild ride of the growth of the industry is far from over. We're finally getting men and women of all ages playing in games for the first time, which is a great thing. Okay, so that's my little preamble about games. Let me now move into space for a minute, how games parlay into space. So, at least for me growing up, I think space is cool for anybody, but for me it was a little bit closer to home, you might say. Not only was my father an astronaut, but literally my right and left-hand neighbors were astronauts. Everyone around in the neighborhood who weren't astronauts were NASA contractors involved in putting people into space. So I just assumed, everybody went to space. They did. In fact, it was funny that I used to think of these Sesame Street people as a fantasy until I went to college and realized the butcher, the baker, and the fireman are actually normal. But I had a NASA doctor when I was about 14 tell me because I had bad eyesight, I was not going to be eligible to be an astronaut. And I'd never thought when I grew up to be one, I just assumed we're all going. But I was honestly crushed when I was told, by the way, you are no longer eligible to be a member of the club that your father and all your neighbors and all your friends are members of. And so I was like, well, that sucks, and who are you to be the gatekeepers of who gets to go? I said, if I can't go with your space program, I'm going to make my own. And at the age of 14, that doesn't sound that hard. Oh, it's really effing hard. And I won't tell you all the failures along the path, but it really began to work when we started something called the X Prize, a $10 million prize for the first private vehicle to request in space. A company called Zero G, that we fly Zero G Bravos with. A company called Space Adventures, which finally decided to crack the door open for flying people in space. And I was actually originally supposed to be the first private citizen to go into space because it was my company and I built it so I could go. And the stock market crashed and all my money's in the internet. And so I actually had to sell my first seed to a guy named Dennis Tito, who became the first. And so I had to recover and cycle back, so I became the sixth. But just because you want to go, just because you built an industry that can take you, just because you paid your money to go, still doesn't mean they will let you go until you pass all the medical pre-qualification, which is still dramatic, especially for me, because I actually had an internal anomaly called a hemangioma on my liver. I actually had to remove one lobe of my liver before they would allow me to fly in space, because they were worried about potential internal bleeding in case of an interspace accident. So I had to undergo life-threatening surgery after paying my money. So I was like, now what are you going to do? I guess I'm going through the surgery. So I had some issues. But then at the beginning of 2008, I went to start my training in Star City in Russia. I'm now a fully trained cosmonaut. I know how to operate every system on board that Soyuz. Same thing is true for the International Space Station. Every member of the crew has to be able to independently operate every piece of equipment. Not only so you don't have to pester other people when you want to use it, but also so you can back each other up in case of emergencies. I had to pass all the same exams as any other astronaut and cosmonaut, which fortunately I did pass. And then on October of 2008, as I'm sure you would guess, it's a mighty good day when you put on your spacesuit, crawl out to a fully fueled rocket that's covered with frost and fog is streaming down the sides of it, and while everybody else gets as far away as they can, you climb inside and light the sucker up. And it's truly an amazing ride. But of course, even on the ride up, I couldn't not engage gaming. I knew, on my logbook, I knew when a camera would be turned on that would face me, and so on the back of that page of my logbook,